evening, and thank you for joining us at the Washington County Free Library this evening. The Western Maryland Room is honored to welcome Reverend John Schildt this evening for a very unique discussion of the 29th Infantry, the Blue and Gray Division in World War II. This division, as he will tell us in a few moments, has a lot of local ties to Maryland. He is going to give us a full story about that.
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks for the invitation to be here in the presence of some distinguished scholars from Antietam, and so I have to try to be on my toes. And again, it's really an honor to be here. We think about the 29th Division, and I'll get into it in a moment, but one of your handouts had to do with Captain Leroy Wells. Some of you who are past 39 may have remembered him as being the postmaster in Bedford in the post-war years. I had the privilege of going to Normandy 6 times, 3 times with the veterans of the 29th Division in 1988 when they dedicated the memorial, and then in 1994 when the 50th anniversary of DDay was observed, and then in 1998, normally they just went to Normandy, but in 98 they went to Brest, and toward that area, that's where the German submarine camps were. In 1998, I had met the former mayor of St. Louis, and we had become good friends. And in 98, I led my first tour, and of course we had a police escort. And Washington County is in St. Louis. Captain Wells' daughter, Sharon Block, married to Charlie, took some of her father's memorabilia along, and I know you can't see it, but we got a Washington County flag in the museum there, and that was the courtesy of former County Commissioner Ron Bowers that he sent that along, so that proudly hangs in the museum in St. Louis. Then the tourism director in Frederick County ran an American flag up at over the grave of Francis Scott Key. So we also presented that to the Hotel de Ville. The Hotel de Ville is City Hall in France. So Washington County's is represented in St. Louis. Again, we thank you for your presence. We have some folks from up around Breezewood and Bedford, go quite a ways down here. The one lady's grandfather was a veteran of World War I. Jeff Folks, who's here, one of his relatives was Morris Paulsgrove from Chewsville, and he was in the D-Day landings. So one of the things that I'd like Catherine to come up, I'd like to present to her, each of the 3 regiments had a day book, and this tells where the regiment was each day, casualties, decorations, and all of that. This is for the 175th Infantry. The 115th and the 116th will follow. Well, I'm still working on that. Also, we give you a regimental crest of the 115th Infantry. That's where the folks from this area, they were in that unit. Sadly, the Pentagon disbanded that unit, my old unit, a couple of years ago, and now the only infantry unit in the Maryland National Guard is the 175th Infantry from Baltimore. So that's tiny. That's a little bigger, but that's for the John Fry Law. So
Thank you.
you're very welcome. Right.
I'm a little overcome. This was kind of a surprise to not know that this was part of our evening plan. Thank you. Thank you on behalf of the library, on behalf of the Western Maryland Group, and on behalf of everybody, by donating to the library, of course, this becomes something that our patrons and our public can access and learn from. This will preserve this story. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. Merci beaucoup. Okay. All right. Let's get started. Here. This has all been digital, put on, the computer, but some older folks like me, we like to hold papers and hold things in our hands. So the long blue and gray line, of course, the blue and gray is the symbol of the 29th Division, which we will get into after a while. If I can move it, am I doing something wrong? Oh, there we go. Okay. The thrust of this lecture is that military units have a genealogy the same as human beings. And so as we look at the long blue and gray line, we find that the division was organized on the eve of World War I, but the regiments in the division are all older than the nation itself. And
maybe the other button.
So anyhow, she's fixing it. There were 3 regiments. All were National Guard units at the beginning of World War I. And the 116th, which was formerly the 1st Virginia, from basically the Shenandoah Valley, there we go, okay, is the oldest. It dates back to 1742, and it was founded by none other than one of the ancestors of George Smith, Patton, General Blood and Guts of World War II. The 115th came from the counties of Maryland, and some of the leaders were Thomas Cressup and Joseph Chapline, believe it or not, the founder of Sharpsburg. And then that was at the time of the French and Indian War. And then the 175th came along later in 1774 from Baltimore. And so those 3 regiments comprise the World War II 29th Division. This is the flag of the 116th. In 1992, it observed its 250th anniversary, and at that time, it had 42 battle streamers. I am not sure now how many they might have, because the naming commission took away almost half of them because they were Civil War streamers. And of course, the various forts where the 29th trained before and after the war, Fort A.P. Hill, Fort Pickett, and Fort Lee. And I don't know where Fort Hood, whether that was renamed or not, but the 116th, and probably there's more information on it, and I guess that's because of all of the publicity that Jonathan Jackson got. Well, there we go. Okay. The 1st Virginia, as I said, came from Augusta County. One of the early commanders was none other than George Washington, and he had headquarters in Winchester, and then went on out, was with Braddock's troops, and he was instrumental in saving the remnants of Braddock's command. One of the Indian chieftains had a couple of his best shots, best marksmen fire about 9 arrows at Washington, and none of them hit him. And the chieftain was amazed, and he finally said, stop. That man's protected by the great being. No use to keep on shooting him. So Braddock saved the remnants of Braddock's command, and of course Braddock is supposed to have gone to Sharpsburg. And one of the early leaders of the 1st Maryland was a colonel. I don't know how much military training he had, but his name was Joseph Chaplin. He was at Fort Cumberland, Maryland, and then also at Fort Frederick. And as a reward after the war, he was given huge land grants. And folks from Sharpsburg, maybe you can give thanks that Chaplin gave his time and service to the help of his country during the French and Indian War. One of the things that really amazes me and makes me tired to think about it, over at Elmwood Cemetery in Shepherdstown is the BLine Monument. And at that time, in 1775, after the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, why Washington and the Continental Congress called for troops. They needed them badly. And lo and behold, Morgan's rifles and other troops from the northern Shenandoah Valley, as well as Cressup's rifles, marched 550 miles, part of it largely through the wilderness. One time I set a road and somebody took me to task and said, no road. Once they got beyond Philadelphia, a lot of it was just trails. But just think of it, 550 miles in 3 weeks. And they joined Washington's army at Concord. And that monument used to stand out along the road there, just out across from the Elmwood Cemetery, but it's now in the cemetery. But the BLine March. So think about marching from Shepherdstown and Frederick, 3 weeks, 550 miles. The Continental soldiers were sharp. Again, they fought like the Indians. The British regulars weren't used to that kind of action. And at Saratoga, which was one of the turning points of the war, Morgan's rifles, as they moved up, they knew the general area. They used the turkey call, the turkey gobble, and the bird calls like the Indians, you know, when they used to get in place. And of course, the British just thought, that's a little turkey out there or something. And it was Morgan's rifles from the Berryville area getting into position to cover or to attack the Brits up at Saratoga. Now, we've talked a little bit about the 1st Virginia from the Shenandoah Valley, the 115th from Western Maryland, and then we come to what is now the 175th Infantry, the only infantry in Maryland, and I'm not quite as familiar, so I'll read just a little bit. But it was organized on December the 3rd, 1774, by a young Baltimore merchant, Mordecai Gist. And in time, it became the Dandy Fifth. That's the way it was known. And in January of 1776, it became known as the Maryland Line and was under the command of Colonel William Smallwood. 7 companies. Okay, they did not join Washington's army till July of 1776. And then, folks, in all of these units, the parts, the long line of the blue and gray, had distinguished moments. And some of you watch Kelsey Grammer. I've seen, I don't know how many repeats, and I still like them, but several times they've shared the story of the Maryland line. 400 soldiers, actually they say it was closer to 300, covered the withdrawal of Washington's army at Brooklyn Heights. 5 times they charged the British forces, which greatly outnumbered them, until only 93 were left. This was the first time, apparently, that the bayonet was used in and effectively in an engagement. After the retreat, and remember, if you watched Grammar, the fog closed in, and somebody has written a book, God's Hand in American History, and said that the Maryland line covered the retreat, but God sent the fog, and the British, they knew they were leaving, but they couldn't see. And Washington exclaimed, "My God, what brave men I must lose today. They have brought in blood that hour more precious to American history than any other time in its history." Washington also called on the Maryland line, what is now the 175th, at White Plains, Harlem Heights, Trenton, and Princeton. So that's also, Catherine has the World War II. I have another synopsis here that I will also give her momentarily. So this is a drawing of Saratoga, and I've shared about the Maryland line. And then the Virginia troops, we don't hear a whole lot about the 1st of Maryland during the Revolution, other than the Long March. But the Virginia troops were in the Carolinas and then at Yorktown. And what a day that was. Just think, a bunch of ragtag militia defeated the greatest army in the world at that time. And the British marched out to surrender. As the bands played, the world turned upside down. And truly, the world was turned upside down at that time. And so the troops, the forerunners of the 29th were involved. Okay, we come to the War of 1812, and we're just trying to tell you again that military units, like families, have a genealogy. And the War of 1812, and the British landed, and once again, the Dandy 5th, the Maryland line, now the 175th Infantry, stopped the British at North Point and also near Washington. So they were involved there. Now, we have to realize that with 3 units and almost 300 years of history, this is a shotgun approach. But nevertheless, I hope it will be meaningful. So we hurry forward to the war between the states. And don't throw rocks at me, some say the war of Yankee aggression. But anyhow, the war between the states, great division everywhere, neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. I served a little church down at Mount Carmel, and the preacher was asked to leave with the election of Lincoln because for some reason he told the people that he had voted for Lincoln. He was one of 7 in the Boonesboro precinct. That gentleman, he wound up out in Iowa till things cooled down. But he probably maybe shopped at some of his descendants' stores because the preacher was the Reverend Isaac K. Stanton, the great-grandfather of the Stanton brothers, Stanton Furniture. Anybody buy furniture from them? So anyhow, and of course there was Fort Sumter, and things really got hot, and Virginia waited to the last moment to succeed. And then the Virginia Militia, Company B, from Shepherdstown, and units from Winchester, Perryville, Charlestown. They all hurried to Harper's Ferry to try to capture the arsenal before the Yankees destroyed it, but they didn't get there quite in time. We have a picture of the Virginia militia, and of course, one of the members of Company B was from Shepherdstown in the 2nd Virginia, was a young gentleman by the name of Henry Kid Douglas. And I think he was maybe the only man who has gone from a private to a colonel in both the Northern and Southern armies, even to a 1-star general, but we'll get to that a little later. And of course, it was at Harper's Ferry that Dennis Fry's the gentleman that knows all about that. He's a great guru about Harper's Ferry. Thomas Jonathan Jackson, that strange man from VMI down in Lexington, molded 5 Virginia regiments together, the 2nd, 4th, 5th, 27th, and 33rd, into a unique first-class infantry brigade. They had their baptism of fire across the river at Falling Waters. The Rockbridge artillery was commanded by William Nelson Pendleton, an Episcopal cleric. The 4 cannon were named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and supposedly the command was aim, fire low, and may God have mercy on their souls. Then it was on to the heroes of Manassas. And we've all heard which came first, chicken or the egg. Would we have ever heard of Stonewall Jackson had it not been for the war? It's doubtful. But does the time make the person, or the person the time? Probably a combination. I'm not going to comment on either one. But it was there as the Yankees were moving forward, and Jackson's men held firm, and General B yelled, there stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians. And so a great name was given to these 5 Virginia regiments, and that name being the Stonewall Brigade. Wonderful statue, and I'm not sure whether at this moment or not, but the Stonewall Brigade had been allowed to wear a patch, shoulder patch, with a depiction of this monument on their left sleeve. So, and then of course came the famous Valley Campaign, which is still studied all over the world in the spring of '62. Over 600 miles, 7 or 8 battles, and there's a person, some people thinks that Henry Kid Douglas gets too much credit, but I wonder about that. I've been doing some research recently, and I found that on the eve of the campaign, Douglas was sent to take orders to Richard Ewell in central Virginia. And he rode through stormy weather, muddy roads, 106 miles in 20 hours. And Jackson was so impressed that he took him on his staff, but you know, to me, it's unfathomable. I can't imagine 550 miles in 3 weeks. I can't imagine over 100 miles on horseback in 20 hours, but Jackson did that. And of course, that campaign is still studied all over the world. Of course, here we have a picture of young Douglas, later a Hagerstown lawyer, and later, as we shall see, the Adjutant General of the state of Maryland. Okay, one of the unique things in American history. On May the 25th, 1862, south of here at Front Royal, Virginia, the 1st Maryland USA fought the 1st Maryland CSA. And it was the 5th Maryland, or the 1st Maryland USA was basically members of the what was to become the 175th Infantry in Baltimore. So their patch was designated later, and on the little regimental crest that I gave Catherine, it says "Rally Around the Flag," and that was what Colonel Kinley, the commander of the 1st Maryland USA, said to his troops: "Rally around the flag." And of course, one of the unique things, the Maryland Monument for many years was the only monument that said anything about the Confederacy on the Antietam or Sharpsburg battlefield. That's why we have it. But 6 units in the Union Army, 2 units in the Confederates, and the plaque says, "Maryland's Memorial to her sons who fought on these fields." Doesn't say blue and gray, doesn't say north or south. Okay, this is one of my favorite spots as we think about the various units and their history and military genealogy. This is down near what was Fort A.P. Hill, and it is Moss Neck Manor. And this was the camping area for 3 months, actually closer to 4, after the Battle of Fredericksburg. And General Jackson and his staff played with little Janie Corbin. The general apparently even sat on the floor and cut out paper dolls with her, as did Henry Kidd Douglas. And the little Janie asked for the general's gold braid, and of course he wasn't very fancy anyhow, Jackson, so he cut the braid. And 30 years ago, I knew where the braid was. It was in the descendants of Janie Corbin's mother's family. But just before the Battle of Chancellorsville, why Janie and her little cousins fell ill and died, and they said that Jackson and most of the staff wept. And then, of course, came Chancellorsville, and Mighty Stonewall was killed or mortally wounded. Jackson or Douglas and the staff. You don't need to see me, you can hear me. So when you get older, sometimes you get bad knees, and after a while, those bad knees match up. We can see Jackson said, or Lee said, he has lost his left arm, but I lost my right arm. Okay, Catherine's to the rescue. Okay, thank you so much. And of course, the Army of Northern Virginia was never the same. James Power Smith was on Jackson's staff, and he was a Presbyterian cleric, lived in 1923. And Reverend Smith said, when God decided that it was time for the South to lose the war, he took Jackson. So I throw that statement out for what it's worth. And of course, there was Gettysburg. Wesley Culp was killed right close to his home. He had gone to fight for the South. Douglas was badly wounded, wound up in a prisoner of war camp, but survived. And then, of course, came Appomattox. The Shenandoah Valley was ravaged, as Sheridan did. Red October burned from Harper's Ferry down to Lexington, saying that even a crow flying over the area couldn't find something to eat. And many of the Southern soldiers went home. Those that were lucky enough to have a horse or a mule, with just the horse or mule between their legs and their clothing and maybe their weapons. So as the years passed, Douglas, he was the last commander of the Stonewall Brigade, now the 116th Infantry. And I get perturbed when some of these Southern leaders are put down for having served in the Confederacy, because I look at the before and the after. And there was a movement, I don't want to stir up anything, to removed the name of Henry Kid Douglas Highway out going to the DMV. But after the war, 1892 to 96, he served as the Adjutant General of the state of Maryland. A black lady has just been promoted to Major General and is the new Adjutant General. But Douglas was the Adjutant General. Governors even before called on his advice. He helped to put down a railroad strike out in Cumberland, and he hosted John McClellan in 1885 when he spoke at Antietam. So to me, Douglas's service to the state and the nation, particularly after the war, and he was invited to attend, personal invitation to attend Grant's funeral. So it looks like some of the northern officers, and he was a friend of General Hartranft and Hancock and some others. Okay, now we're going through the childhood age, the adolescent, and young adult years of the 29th, the various wars. Various units took part in all the major engagements, and then came 1917. And at that time, the different regiments and were formed, state regiments, militia, were formed into numbered federal regiments and into divisions. In New England, the National Guard troops became the 26th Division. In Pennsylvania, the National Guard became the 28th. Originally, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia, and even some parts of DC were put into the 29th, but basically it wound up that the 116th from Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, and the counties of Western Maryland became the 115th, and they adopted the blue and gray patch. Again, this was a terrible fight this past summer. Letters, meeting, congressional hearings, and actually the people in France sort of turned the tide because the naming commission went over to France to check things out, what the 29th had done, and when they arrived, thousands of French people were at the Division Monument. They said, basically, don't touch this monument. The men and others who wore that patch were our liberators. They freed us. And so we were able to keep the patch. But the blue, the north, the gray, wasn't a sign of division, it was a sign of unity. Maryland and Virginia fighting together against a common enemy. And it's also part of the yin and yang, the Korean symbol of eternity. So then it was over there, you remember that great song? And over to France, and 2 members at least were awarded the Medal of Honor. Henry Costin in Maryland, and a gentleman in the southern part of the Shenandoah Valley. Reverend Snyder, he was a postmaster after the war, in World War I. He was there, and the division was awarded battle streamers for the Meuse, Argonne, and the Alsace conflict. So in the 1930s, General D. John Markey was the face of the 29th, and believe it or not, he was one of the first, if not the first, coach of the Maryland Aggies, now the University of Maryland. And in 1935, he spoke at Memorial Day here in Sharpsburg. 1937, he commanded the troops that reenacted the battle at the 75th anniversary at Bloody Lane. And he lied about his age, and he was a veteran of the Spanish-American War. He was at the Eagle Pass down on the Mexican border, and he commanded a machine gun battalion in World War I. And somehow he caught the eye of General John J. Pershing. And after the war, Pershing tapped him to become a member, and I think maybe even chairman, I'm not sure, of the American Battle Monuments Commission. And they oversaw the placement of memorials all over France or wherever World War I took place. Now, when he retired in 1960, 1940 couple, when the division was mobilized for World War II, he was almost 60. So I said he was too old for vigorous training, so he was one of the first commanders of Fort A.P. Hill. But in his retirement, he lived catty-cornered across the street from me, right next to Mr. Snyder, and he always called me boy. He said, "Boy, would you like to see some military things?" I said, "Well, sure, sir." And here he showed me some letters from General Pershing, as well as not his Distinguished Cross, but the Distinguished Service Medal for working with the American Battle Monuments Commission. And on one of his last tours, he and his wife took a side trip, and they went to the pyramids of Egypt, and I got a card, still have it, and it says, "Boy, no grass to mow here." So he was kind of fellow. Very nice, walked ramrod straight, and later lost a bid to become a U.S. Senator. Okay, this is the Frederick Armory, and in 1940, the division was notified to get ready to be mobilized, and so they gathered at the armories in 1940. Okay, thank you, Catherine. 1940, the headquarters of the 115th, that's the counties of Maryland, was in the Frederick Armory. And along with Company A, Crescent Rifles, B Company, under Captain Well, was located in the Hagerstown Armory, C Company, 1st Battalion, Cumberland, D, and Frostburg, all National Guard. And there was no trouble getting recruits because they got $2 a drill, weekly drill, 2 to 3 hours, $2. And you say, "Well, that wasn't worthwhile." Well, if you get a Coke for 5 cents, you can get a candy bar for 5 cents. Some of you might remember that. And February the 3rd, 1941 was MDay. That was mobilization day. And I'll back up a minute. And that's the day they signed up, left for their armories for intensive maneuvers, encampment and training at Fort Lee. So in the fall of 1941 was the famed Carolina maneuvers, and that was the last of the horse soldiers and one at the beginning of half tracks and mechanization. This was a card my uncle sent me. You can see the date, and they were still using horses. And you say, "Well, I don't believe it." Okay, the Frederick paper runs columns of 100 years ago and 50 years ago. Again, I'm sort of a pack rat, but I have one clipping. June, I think the 22nd, 1938. Today, a column of horses and wagons passed to Frederick, 1938. They were hauling tents and blankets and items for the reunion of the remaining blue and gray soldiers coming for the reunion at Gettysburg. That was 1938. So, we're coming up fast on 100 years. But one of my a gentleman, a veteran who became a close friend was Colonel William Putney. He was from Arizona, and he graduated from the University of Arizona in 1941. And he had grown up on a ranch, and so he was assigned to Fort Hood, Texas. And guess to what unit? The famed 7th Cavalry, Custer's Gary Owen unit. And the commander was a lieutenant colonel by the name of Gerhart. And later, Putney went on Gerhart's staff. But he told the story. He said, I went on the Carolina maneuvers as a young shaved tail or second lieutenant, as a mounted horseman, cavalryman. And before the maneuvers were over, it was a couple of months, he said, here I was riding in half tracks. We'll talk more about him after a while. He was a wonderful guy. So, on the way home from the maneuvers, the 29th Division had camped down on the Virginia-North Carolina border, and they got the news of Pearl Harbor. So they came home to the armory, and that meant they were in for the duration. And some of them never got home to stay home permanently because they had a rendezvous with destiny over in Europe, in Overlord, and in Normandy. And just think of it, these two great ocean liners, and I thank Jacob Martz for doing the PowerPoint for me. The entire division, 15,000 strong, crossed the Atlantic on these two ocean liners to Europe. And the rations lingered behind. So anyhow, the Brits fed the 29ers mutton and Brussels sprouts. And when they lined up before the American rations arrived, the guys would stand in the chow line and go, bah, and Brussels sprouts, I don't know how many of them told me that they never ate another piece of lamb or Brussels sprouts after. And things didn't go so well. The Brits didn't care for them because some of the Americans were mouthy. They asked them the question, does it ever stop raining over here? And they complained about warm beer instead of cold beer. And the feeling was mutual because the Brits said the Americans are overpaid, oversexed, and over here. And but in time, that sort of came around, and the 1st Division had moved on to attack North Africa, and the Brits looked upon the 29th as their own division. So later we'll get to it. As they trained for Overlord, Hagerstown's very own Captain Leroy Well led the troops into St. Lo. And of course, as they trained, got ready, why, there was the rendezvous with the beaches. And St. Lo is a beautiful city, and the flowers and all of that. And the objective after D-Day was the city of St. Lo. Of course, as you know, there were 5 landing beaches. The Canadians and the Brits had 2 of them, and then the American 4th Division was assigned to Utah Beach, and the 29th and the 1st Division, the Big Red one, was they were assigned to Omaha. And so they loaded up on the night of June the 4th, and a big storm came. And how many of you have seen The Longest Day? Okay, most of you. You're familiar with that then. And so the ships were loaded, and the weather forecaster said, well, there's going to be a brief lull. And I said, I don't like it, but we must go. And I once heard General Eisenhower's grandson speak about his grandfather. And he said his grandfather, I always talked about the loneliness of decision, that the buck indeed stops here. So they landed, they boarded the various troop ships, and they went out to the Piccadilly Circus and got ready to head into Normandy across the English Channel. But as you very well remember, the Germans were waiting with the Atlantic Wall, and Rommel said that they must be stopped at the beach. If they get on the beach, it's all over. It will be the longest day. And of course, again, God's hand in D-Day. It rained up until just maybe 36 hours before the invasion. The Germans felt that the invasion would not come in the rain. Rommel had gone home because of that fact, because it was his wife's birthday. And when the landing did occur and they needed to bring up reinforcements, nobody had the nerve to awaken Adolf Hitler. So defer. So away all boats about 3 o'clock in the morning. So as we back up, let's see, maybe I have to go the other way, I guess, yeah. We'll get there, okay. The 29th Division was assigned the area of Omaha Beach. And there were 3 little towns there: Colville-sur-Mer, Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, and Pierreville-sur-Mer. And that's the area where the 29th landed. As they got into the Higgins boats, 32 a boat, and then it was away to the shore. And in early July of 1944, the telegraph machine in Green's drugstore in Bedford, Virginia, started to crank. We regret to inform you, and it listed a gentleman who was a casualty. Another one followed, another one. Before the telegraph machine got finished sending out the telegrams, there were the names of 21 young men. Bedford had a population of 5,400. 21 of them were killed on D-Day. The Cornelius Ryan, who wrote The Longest Day, said that no city in America suffered the losses as did Bedford, Virginia. Through the years, as members of the association, I had the privilege of meeting a lot of the D-Day veterans, officiating at over 30 funerals. And this is Ray Stevens. He had a twin brother. They were on different landing craft, and his twin brother was killed. And of course, Ray was wounded. He's not been dead very long. But one of the landing craft of the 116th, when they put the ramp down, a shell hit the front of the ramp, and only one of the 30 guys on board survived. When the 115th came in, the son of the man who cut my hair as a boy was in that landing, and my barber showed me the letter. He said, I don't know whether I walked, swam, or how I got to shore. But he said, as I saw the planes going overhead and saw all the ships around me, I was never prouder to be an American. The finest hours of the division, once they passed from state militia into the division, happened to be on D-Day in the bocage or hedgerow country, and then in the attack on St. Lo. 10,000 graves are here at Colville-sur-Mer, and 1,000 of them are 29ers, 1/10. There were 11 members of Company B from Hagerstown who were killed in Europe in the campaigns over there. I know of one that is buried there. Some of the others may have come home, but there were 11. Okay. And then again, at 10 o'clock, the 115th was committed. And because the 116th went ashore at Vierville-sur-Mer, and the 115th at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, and both of them were awarded the Distinguished Unit Citation. The 116th lost 800 men out of 3,000 on D-Day. And there's the regimental crest that I gave to Catherine, and there's the Civil War rally around the flag coming from Front Royal down in Virginia in 1862. Also, I know you can't see it too well, but this is a painting of D-Day, if you remember The Longest Day, and also Saving Private Ryan. One of our members was one of the advisors to the film company, and that did Private Ryan. And on one of my trips, he had heard that a veterans group was coming, and Steven Spielberg left 2 huge arrangements of flowers to be used in the memorial service. So we thought that was pretty kind of him. All right. For some reason, I became very interested in this gentleman, and he was in Company B, and I tried to find out where he came from. And then one day, Kathleen Boyer, her daddy, is the one that saved the bricks from the Dunkard Church. Kathleen said, "Well, John, I can tell you." She said, "I don't know how long, but for a while, he lived 4 doors away from me on Chetwynd Street in Sharpsburg. And but he's considered Boonesboro his home." And one of the handouts that I've given you, you have the story of Captain Weddle, and you have the listing of the 11 men. So on my trips, when I've taken groups, I always order. I never took more than 36, but I always order 36 carnations and tell the people beforehand when we go to the cemetery, I'll have flowers for you. And if you have relatives or friends that have someone buried over there, you take the flower and put it on their graves, or you just do whatever. On my 3 trips, he's buried in the last row in our cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer. I take the carnation back and put it on Pete Gettridge's grave, and we've been in touch with the family. One of the neat things that they do over there is that local people adopt a grave, and this is a lady in Carroll in Vierville-sur-Mer, and several times a year she'll take a flower and put it on Pete's grave. And if the people in Normandy realize, the old timers especially, that if you were connected with any of the troops that landed on D-Day, you are it. I've seen Frenchmen that maybe they only know about a half a dozen words of English, thank you being one, and liberator. And and they'll come up and kiss the American's hand and the flag, and that is very touching. But this is one of the local boys, B Company, 115th Infantry, buried overseas. Okay, the commander was General Gerhart. He was great, as was Patton, playing horse polo, and he was a Custer type officer. Somebody said that he had was the only division commander that was a corps commander. He had a division at the front, live troops, another division in the cemetery, dead, and another division in the hospital, wounded. So, and that's his Jeep. The Jeep's name was Vixen Tour, and usually he had a dog, stray dog that he picked up, and the dog's name was DDay. So, and that Jeep, in 1994, they brought it to France and started to drive it over 100 miles from Paris to Normandy, and it heated up, so they put it on a flatbed truck and brought it to Normandy and drove it in all the ceremonies. You can still see it. It's down at the 5th Regiment Armory in Baltimore. And it had a blowout, and some of you who are over 39 might remember the Vulcan patch. That patch is still on the tire after all these years. But Gerhart was quite a guy. And Saint-Lô, which was the key to the breakout of Normandy, was to be taken in 6 days. But they got a little bit behind time. It took 6 weeks and close to 11,000 casualties because they ran into the hedgerows, and these are hundreds of years old, mounds of dirt with rocks and trees. And you remember, you students, how the tanks would try to go over them, and they'd go up, and the Germans would shoot into the belly of the trunk of the tank, and then they put these steel prongs in front, and they just go through. But anyhow, the bocage hedgerow, and the American and English intelligence had underestimated the hedgerows. They thought they were like England, but much thicker and much worse. And the veterans say that progress was measured not in miles, but by field and yard. And then the objective was Saint-Lô. This is the ramparts, the fort, so to speak. Part of it dates back to the 18th century, or the 8th century. And during the 50th anniversary, I stayed in a hotel, and the window looked right out, and at night you could look out and see the spotlight flying on the flag of Normandy. My roommate was a member of the 175th. He lost his leg in crossing the Ruhr, but that never stopped it. At night, he'd get ready for bed, put his pajamas on, and he'd scoot on his knees to the bathroom to clean his teeth and get ready for bed. Tremendous guy, but the cost and the price of war. So again, Saint-Lô was like Gettysburg, and took 6 weeks to cover 20 miles. The militia, Morgan's rifles, and Cressup's rifles, they took 3 weeks to cover 550 miles. It took American forces, the 1st and the 29th Division, 6 weeks to get to Saint-Lô. This was Église Notre Dame. This is a picture in 1944. That's a picture about 20, 30 years ago. Actually, Saint-Lô was called the capital of the ruins. And the former mayor who took us to a reception at Hotel de Ville was an altar boy in 1944. And he said he went to church, the bombs were falling and all of that. And the priest met him and said, young man, it's no use. He said, I don't think we can have Mass today. You go home and you and your family better head to the mountains. And when he retired, he opened a museum in San Lo. Well, I'll back up a minute. I got to share something, and I hope you don't think that I'm beating my own drum, but this Église Notre Dame is one of the great moments in my life. In 1994, on Saturday, June the 4th, was pouring down rain. And a knock came to the door. It was a Catholic priest. What in the world? He said, come along. He said, I understand. He said, call me Padre. He said, come along. He said, I understand there are two priests here. We're going up to church. Okay. So we go up. He says, tomorrow, and once we get there, tomorrow is the International Ecumenical Service. And we would like you folks to have the service. So there were two DDay veterans, and I felt so badly. He looked at one who was an infantryman and who was wounded. You offer the prayers. He looked at the other who was an engineer, and he said, you do the scriptures. He pointed at me, you do the homily. So that was 10 o'clock in the morning. Church was 9 o'clock the next day. 3,000 people, international. And I really didn't get to work on it till after 8 o'clock. And the hotel didn't have a copying machine, and I had to write everything out for the French interpreter. So that was a little stressful, but quite a moment. 3,000 were there the next day. And again, it holds over 3,000. Okay, now we come to Company B, Hagerstown. I'm sure Captain Weddell and the 11 who were killed and many others had never heard of a French town of about 20,000 called Saint-Lô. But again, it was the key to the breakout. This was a family mausoleum. That was the headquarters when Captain Weddell led the first troops in on the 18th of July. And as they were going in, mortar exploded, tore up his left arm. As I understand it, it was never right. His daughter actually worked here for 30 years, Sharon Weddell Block, in the library, and I'm so disappointed she couldn't come. But anyhow, Captain Weddell went in this mausoleum with the battalion commander, and the first sergeant took lath from bombed ruins and splinted his arm, and that saved his arm. And of course, again, the guideline of the headquarters. Okay, now once again, the picture over here to the left is one of the epic stories of the Battle of Normandy. And the Civil War had Tom Jackson, World War II Major Tom Howie, former teacher at the Stanton Military Academy. As I said, our barber had a son in the 115th, and I went there to get my hair cut. Life in August of 44. Life magazine was 10 cents at that time, and picked up the magazine, and I saw that picture over there in the left-hand corner, and I started to cry. Young boy. I pulled the magazine up so the men couldn't see that this kid was crying, because there was the flag draped casket of the Major of Saint-Lô. Of course, he wasn't named because of security reasons, and that was the way it looked back in 44. There's signs that are there on the wall at this time. So again, that picture introduced me more or less to Saint-Lô. And so right before, or on the 17th, the Germans, the 116th, was ready to make an attack, the final attack, and the German artillery and mortar barrage delayed that. So as the staff meeting broke up, Major Howie said to his company commanders, "See you in St. Lo." And in a couple of minutes, shell exploded, and he was mortally wounded, didn't last very long. So we go back to 1941 and Bill Putney. I knew known that there was an officer by that name with Major Howie, and in 1992, I was in Boston, and our reunion, and I checked in, and this tall gentleman came in, and they asked his name, and he said, "Putney." I said, "Sure. Are you the officer that was with Major Howie when he got hit?" He said, "He died in my arms." So we became fast friends, and the veterans of World War II couldn't have been any nicer to those of us who came later. So at the tail end of the 50th anniversary, they had a big parade in the Champs-Élysées going up to the Arc de Triomphe. So we all said, "We post-war guys, we're not going. This is your day. You were here. We don't deserve to be any part of it." And Bill Putney was the one who grabbed me by the arm, and somebody grabbed the others. "You're going with us." So anyhow, I had the privilege of walking beside of Bill Putney, who took Major Howie's place after he was killed. General Gerhart heard about it, and he said, "The major's going to St. Lo." Said, "Get a jeep and a box and take him in to St. Lo, because the capture of the city belongs not only to the living, but to all who fell along the way." So they took him in, and there's the memorial. And every year on Liberation Day, July the 18th, they have big ceremonies. Okay, little boy crying in the barber shop when he sees a picture. 1994, the Thomas Howie Memorial. Sally Howie, the daughter of the major of St. Lo. She was 5 when her daddy was killed. A day earlier, we were in the American military cemetery, and the members of the 81st Airborne were placing French and American flags on the grave, and I was there with a group of people, and this real nice member of the 81st said, "Would you like to put the American flag on this grave?" I said, "Well, if you don't mind, I'll take the French flag." But I said, "Give the American flag to the lady here." So momentarily, Sally Howie, the major's daughter, the daughter of the major of St. Lo, she put the American flag on Tom Howie's grave, and I put the French flag. The barbershop story had come full circle. So that was a great experience. Time went on. Part of the 29th captured Brest, the German submarine pens. They captured Jülich and many other towns. By the time Company A from Frederick got to St. Lo, only 7 of 180 were present for duty that landed. Now, they all weren't dead, but wounded or battle fatigue or whatever. So Pappy Weddle was in his 30s, and little guy, and he had been a barber in Woodsboro, and he could stand $2 extra a week, and so he joined the Guard, was wounded in December, came back, had the premonition that he was going to be killed, and sure enough, in crossing the Ruhr, he was killed. and the American Legion post in Woodsboro is named in his honor. Again, the Medal of Honor recipients, and we got the battle streamers. You can read the beaches of Normandy, northern France, Rhineland, and Central Europe, and the division did liberate some of the Nazi concentration camps, so that's part of the legacy. And then September the 17th, 1988, instead of Lafayette, we were able to say, Lafayette, we are here, and the division monument was dedicated on Omaha Beach, again with French interpreters helping us. Also, ceremonies were held over the memorial. There is built over a German machine gun emplacement, and early in the evening, there's the remnants of the pillbox. The French school group, any of you teachers might be here, they had practiced from January with the sing "My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean" with emotions, and so near sunset they sang "My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean." And I'll never forget, and Keith Snyder was able to get General Sullivan to come to Sharpsburg a couple years ago. But as the sun set on the evening of June the 5th, while General Gordon spoke atop the monument there, and he said, listen, as the waves strike the beach, those who were here, the living and the dead, they're crying out, remember us, remember us. And so that's what we've tried to do as we've looked at the genealogy of some of these units. Again, freedom is never free. 10,000 young Americans in the cemetery at Colville, Samara, along with, of course, Pete Gettridge. And we close with this. We got the some of the part of the prayer at the dedication of the monument. I don't quite remember it all anymore, but they're going now. The planes in the sky, the ships on the sea, and those who landed on Omaha Beach. They're going now. Those who fought through the hedgerow, those who captured Shenandoah and Brest, they're going now. Those who fought in northern Europe, northern France and central Europe, they crossed the Ruhr and took Julie. But we shall long remember the young men of the 1940s, the boys who quickly became men, who gave their best, sometimes their all. Those who wore the blue and the gray, those who were indeed part of the greatest generation. And I'll close with the 29th battle cry. 29, let's go. Thank you for your patience and attention. Thank you. You were very kind and patient. I don't know, you may want to get out of here, but any quick questions? I guess not. Well, again, thank you, and thanks to our host for having us here tonight. Any of you here connected with the 29th? I know you all. Yeah. Anybody else? Well, thank you all for coming.
Hey, thanks for that.